that. Okay, and we're being recorded.
Right.
I'm going to start with just with a little bit to give you a background of how I came to be involved in treaty research. And it begins in the 1980s with Murray Sinclair when he was a lawyer and was taking a couple of cases. Actually, I think one of them was from the Treaty 2 area on hunting and fishing rights in Treaties 1 and 2. And he was taking these cases, he hoped, eventually to the Supreme Court. He became a judge before that happened, but nevertheless, he asked me to pull together the written material, the existing written material on Treaty 1 in particular. And that was partly because, well, entirely actually, because at that time, the courts of Canada didn't give much credence to oral history. They wanted the written record. And the written record, as you know, is told from largely one point of view. There's a lot of it, and it takes a lot of time to sort through it. But that's what my work and interpretations are based upon. And I want to emphasize that there is an oral record that is equally, if not more important. And the Treaty Commission has also pulled together a number of the oral pieces of record in about 4 volumes, I think, or maybe more, Jeremy, I'm not sure now, of oral history of the treaties. So this is part of a story, and it is an interpretation. It's my interpretation, and it'd be interesting if you have comments on it. I would love to hear them. So that's the origin of it. And what I've entitled this one is Making Treaty Relationship, is really exploring the experience of the First Nations who made that journey in 1871 and 72 to Manitoba House and to Lower Fort Garry. What had been their experience in making relationships with others, with the other, whether it was amongst First Nations themselves, whether it was with fur traders or settlers, and eventually with the Crown. So that's the theme that I'm developing, that when people got to Lower Fort Garry in 1871, they had 2 centuries of experience in dealing with non-Indigenous people. Some were settlers, some eventually were the Crown, but initially it was the fur trade. And there are really 3 centuries of fur trader, you know. Okay, the meeting is being recorded sign sort of covers part of my screen for me, so I'll have to ad-lib a bit there. But I want to begin with why in 1763 the treaty proclamation was issued by the British government. And this really, from the Crown's perspective, why there are treaties. From Indigenous people's perspective, there are different arguments and different purposes. But the origin of treaty making by the Crown in Canada on a large scale, the numbered treaties that you've probably heard about, begins with the proclamation of 1763 that argued that before settlers could move into Indian country, as they called it at the time, there had to be a treaty. And the reason the Crown did this was largely to keep the peace. They wanted a peaceful expansion of European settlement into what they acknowledged to be Indian-owned lands. So it's not particularly altruism or charity. It's the desire of the British government to have peaceful settlement. They never questioned that that settlement should take place, but they wanted it to happen peacefully in order that they didn't have to maintain military posts in the interior, as the French had to do, but that there would be a continued expansion of European settlement into the interior. And so they set in place a series of rules, essentially, as to how this settlement should take place. And first of all, there had to be a treaty made. It could only be made with the Crown. The Crown didn't want to have to deal with treaties made by itinerant missionaries or fur traders or land speculators. It was formal, and it had to be with the crown, and it had to be done publicly in a public setting. And they required that to be done before settlers arrived. Now, more often than not, it wasn't done before settlers arrived, but in some cases it was, particularly in Ontario. The proclamation required that First Nations ownership of the land be acknowledged with a payment, that annual payments, a continuation of the relationship, and I'm going to come back to that later on, but that's in a sense what annuities represented, or treaty money represented at the time, a continuing relationship that would happen once a year when the Crown met with First Nations to discuss the treaty, as First Nations had hoped and expected, and the payment would be continued, in part symbolically. Sometimes it was in goods, sometimes it was in actual cash. There was a lot of debate about that in Ontario, particularly in the 19th century. So it was publicly diplomacy and publicly arrived at. And most importantly, some very new research in the last 10 years by John Burroughs, an Indigenous lawyer, has looked at a very large meeting. We're talking of a meeting of several thousand First Nations people at Niagara the year after the proclamation of 1763. And what John Burroughs and others have argued there is that that very large meeting, which may have included people from Lake of the Woods and certainly from the Great Lakes area, as well as Ontario and what became Lower Canada, that this was a confirmation meeting, and it confirmed First Nations agreement with this treaty process that the proclamation had issued. So it's an important addition to the whole history of the proclamation. But what I want to emphasize throughout this story is that treaties were nothing new to First Nations. And I'm sure that, to this particular group, that's not surprising at all. But it is surprising to most non-Indigenous audiences. First Nations made treaties from time immemorial. They made treaties for trade, for the sharing of resources. If they wanted to travel across someone else's territory, it needed a treaty, an agreement. For war and peace, treaties were always made. And I want to give you an example. What I tried to do throughout the PowerPoint is to give you the words of First Nations at the time. Now, they're words as written down by non-Indigenous people, and they're also words which have been translated. So still, here's what Chief Hole in the Day, an Ojibwe or Chippewa chief, said as late as the 1830s of an example of a treaty between his people, the Chippewas, they're called in the United States, and the Sioux. And he said, the Sioux said to us, such a peace between you and us, one that the Sioux had proposed, will be of advantage to both. And they had been probably intermittently not the best of friends for maybe 50 years or even more. So this was unusual and momentous. Let's have a peace. And the Sioux said, you have in your forest many things we need, and we have on our prairies much game which you do not possess. So we made a peace. We invited the Sioux during the next winter to hunt with us in our forests. They came, and we agreed for the whole winter while hunting bears, elks, foxes, and deer. And what I take from this, my interpretation, is that this emphasizes, from a First Nations perspective, the importance of annual agreements. We agreed for the whole winter. We're not agreeing for the rest of our lives. We're agreeing for the whole winter. And we're going to hunt bears, elks, foxes, and deer. That is, we're going to share those resources. And it's going to be reciprocal, reciprocity. You've got something we need. We've got something you can use. So it's reciprocal. It's about resource sharing. And you'll notice we invited the Sioux to hunt during the next winter, hunt with us in our forests. That sense of ownership of the lands doesn't change at all. They're our forests, it's our game, and we can share it for a year. And examples of that resource sharing are hundreds throughout First Nations written history, going back to the time of Champlain arriving in Quebec City in the 17th century. This particular quote encapsulates it, and I like it for that reason. We agreed for the whole winter. So keep that in mind when we come back to look at how treaties developed after Confederation. And it makes sense. I want you to think of one extra thing here. If your life is determined to a large extent by the weather, by the habits of particular animals and particular harvesting of whether it's birds or game or berries or timber, your life is dependent upon, to some extent, the weather and the relationships in the natural world. And so it makes sense. This is something that's largely beyond your control. It makes sense to have diplomatic alliances with others, people with whom you can share, whom you can offer things to reciprocally. So as a practice, as a diplomatic practice, a diplomatic tool, First Nations made treaties amongst themselves and continue to until the present day. When the fur traders came, and they came in a couple of waves, in the late 17th century to Hudson's Bay, the Hudson Bay Company and the Nonsuch began the fur trade out of Hudson's Bay. And very shortly afterwards, traders from Quebec and Montreal, through the Great Lakes and through the Winnipeg River system, moved into the Canadian prairies as well. And the trade with First Nations was largely determined by First Nations themselves. The practice of trade was a kind of treaty. The trader didn't just wander around looking for the First Nations encampment that he could find, but they were arranged meetings on an annual basis. The brigades bearing the furs from the west down the Saskatchewan River would come, and they would have agreed to meet with the European fur trader long in advance, and a ceremony would follow. They didn't just wander into the post and say, "I've got some furs, and would you like to have a look at them?" No, it was a formal ceremony. They were greeted by cannon fire, a ceremonial salute at the fur trading post, and they were then seated. Gifts were exchanged, very much in the First Nations diplomatic practice, and speeches were made, and most importantly, the pipe was smoked, and prayers were said. And the pipe was smoked and passed around in a circle where the European traders and his lieutenants and the First Nations negotiators were to sit. And they discussed then for almost 3 days in some examples how life had been in the past year. How many canoes had they brought? How much fur had they got? How had the weather been? How was the brother-in-law? How was your family? These were essentially ways, diplomatic practice of First Nations people in establishing a relationship. And that's what they were doing. And they were doing it in the presence of the Creator. And any European fur trader, Hudson Bay Company, Northwest Company, whatever, who wanted to make a profit, that's what they were there for, in the fur trade, needed to understand First Nations practice, and he needed to adapt to it. When he lived in Scotland or London, he didn't have to have a relationship with the person he traded with. But when he came to North America, he had to follow the practice of First Nations. And so over a long period, and speaking very generally, First Nations found that those first Europeans that they dealt with, and dealt with for 2 centuries, adapted to First Nations practice. And they did that for their own reasons, because they wanted to make a profit. And also because fur traders, European fur traders, were extremely dependent upon Indigenous people. First of all, First Nations, and later on Métis as well. They depended upon First Nations for the labor of the fur trade, the setting of the traps, the checking of the traps, the procuring of the furs, scraping, skinning, and the preparation of the furs, the packing of the furs for transport in those 90-pound packages back to Hudson Bay or to Norway House, for example, to begin the route to Europe. And so the labor in the fur trade was First Nations, and the European fur trader who wanted a profit had to make sure that he understood what their requirements were and to adapt to it. He also needed First Nations for the market. He didn't want to bring an empty ship over from London or Scotland. He needed to fill it with goods that he could also make a profit on. And so First Nations as a market and as the labor force of the fur trade were absolutely indispensable. And of course, for survival, for clothing, for snowshoes, for all of the traditional knowledge that enabled First Nations to survive in North America for thousands of years was again something that the European trader also depended upon. And by the 1780s, those fur trade diplomatic relationships are expanding into family relationships. And you will know, I'm sure, of the fur trade families, particularly who, many of them who came to Red River in their retirement. And I'm going to talk specifically about the Red River situation because it was different than in other treaties. But many of them were fur trade families from Cumberland House, from Brandon House, from further west, even in the Rocky Mountains. But also, I don't want to give the impression that it was all an amicable relationship. It wasn't. It was interdependent because the fur trade also brought epidemics, created fur trade families, but it also brought alcohol in great numbers in certain periods during the fur trade. And of course, it brought guns and disruption of traditional territories of some First Nations. The second group, but a relationship, the relationship was established and it continued, and it was a continuing sense of mutual obligation over 2 centuries in the fur trade. First Nations also had to adapt to a second wave of newcomers. And these were very different, a very different kettle of fish than fur traders. Fur traders hadn't wanted the land particularly. They weren't there to settle. And when they did, they moved to Red River or they went back to Scotland or to the Orkney Islands. But the second wave, we could call it that, begins in 1812 with the Selkirk settlers, those people who are being pushed off their land in the north of Scotland and who, as a charitable endeavor, are being brought to Red River by Lord Selkirk. And these are people who, for the most part, are not going to be dependent on First Nations. For Red River, they do establish a kind of interlocked economy, but they're not, the settlers are not dependent upon First Nations, except after the first decade, perhaps, when they really required the protection and the food that First Nations offered. And that was important, particularly at Norway House and at Rosal River. But the settlers wanted land, and they wanted to use the resources of First Nations, particularly fish, particularly buffalo, and timber. So quite a different challenge for First Nations. How are they going to live with these new people who are no longer dependent upon them in the same way that their old allies and relationship had been? Well, again, they turned to the treaty, an indigenous political diplomatic tool. And they proposed to Lord Selkirk at Point Douglas in 1817, okay, you're here, the settlers are here, we're going to have to figure out how to live together. And the First Nations way of doing that was to make a treaty. We'll have an agreement and we'll revisit it from time to time. And so in 1817 at Point Douglas, at Fort Douglas, I should say, they enter into an agreement with Lord Selkirk, Miles MacDonnell, his governor. And what essentially they do is to, I'm flipping back and forth here. Where am I? Yep. What they do is to establish essentially treaty lines. And they agree with Lord Selkirk's people that his settlers will stay within those boundaries. And I liken that to essentially establishing a reserve for these incoming non-Indigenous settlers. It was 2 miles, 2 miles on either side of the Red River, beginning just south of present-day Selkirk and going to just south, maybe I think about 6 miles south of the present-day Forks. And then along the Assiniboine, the same thing, 2 miles on either side of the Assiniboine River out to just beyond Portage la Prairie. And that was to be where Lord Selkirk's people, the settlers, could raise their cattle and break the land, put up fences and farm. And the First Nations policed that, regulated that over the next half century. And we have a couple of instances, essentially anecdotes of a couple of young European farmers in the 1840s and 50s who wanted to move beyond that 2 mile limit. And one of them, a man called Truthwaite, was quite keen to move beyond, and he went up to Lower Fort Garry to the Hudson's Bay Company, the governor that the Hudson Bay Company had established there, and said, "Here's what I want to do. Is that okay?" And the governor of the Hudson Bay Company, most interestingly, said to him, "Beyond the 2 mile limit is First Nations land. I would advise you to go and see," and he refers to him as Old Peguis, and Chief Peguis was getting quite old by then. "Go and see Chief Peguis. He's the one who will decide." And so Truthwaite goes up to see him, and Peguis gives his permission and that for him to go. They had known each other for quite a while, and he designates him as a son and enables him to live on that land. Other people also found that when they moved beyond that 2 mile limit, there might be a rent to be paid. There certainly might well be a visit from particularly people from Chief Peguis's community. And it was an interesting anecdote that's recounted about the 1880s, I think, in the Selkirk Journal in the newspaper, where one of the settlers involved in the desire to move beyond the 2 mile limit tells the story of being visited by 6 men from Chief Peguis's community. And the interviewer asking him, "Well, what did you do?" And he doesn't actually say what he did, or whether he paid a rent, or whether he made gifts, or what. But he does say, "A settler could not afford to offend an Indian in those days." And I've kind of clipped that phrase because it really gives you a sense of where the power lay until about the 1860s. And things begin to change then. But what the treaty with Lord Selkirk did, it's not a treaty with the Crown, so it's not a treaty in the same way that the numbered treaties are, but it's an indication of how First Nations approached dealing with newcomers. And again, as you're thinking about all those people in 1871 making their way by canoe or horseback or foot to Manitoba House or to Lower Fort Garry, this has been their experience over 2 centuries. Treaties with fur traders, treaties with settlers, 2 very different kind of people. And what it enabled in the Red River area was 2, and eventually 3 with the Métis, 3 ways of life to not necessarily to be in love with each other, but to proceed amicably, to meet for discussion, to meet for agreements, to create rules for each other, and to live in parallel. I think that's probably the best way to describe it, of parallel governments for quite a long time, for many decades. In 1867, a momentous year for Canada, the people of Eastern Canada. The people of Eastern Canada came together in 4 of the provinces anyway to create Confederation. And that Confederation was really based upon a sense of a new empire, a new British and Canadian empire across the North American continent. It was it's what they at the time called an imperial dream. Alexander Morris wrote quite a number of speeches and talks on that, and he later became a commissioner for making Indian treaties in the Prairie West. People of Eastern Ontario and east of Ontario as well looked to Manitoba as that next place of emigration. And of course, like so many non-Indigenous people before them, they saw it as empty land, free land, available for the taking. But there were two things that prevented that. One was that the new Canada had inherited the obligation in the British North America Act to make treaties before settlement occurred. And secondly, the resistance of Louis Riel and the Métis in Manitoba in 1869-70 also ensured that the treaty process would proceed in a particular way in Manitoba. It was also, and I'm mentioning this here, that the late 1860s and early 1870s are a time of really quite dramatic change in this part of the prairies. The railroad in the United States had been completed across the country, which meant settlers weren't now coming by canoe and lake boat along Lake Winnipeg or on foot even on the Dawson Trail. They were coming in trains quite quickly. They could move from the train to the steamboats, which kept schedules and arrived at a certain time, and you could have a weekly schedule of the steamboat, and off you went back from St. Paul, Minnesota, up to Red River. You came quickly and regularly. And also the telegraph. Communication with Eastern Canada had been established very early before, just at the same time, I should say, at the treaty as being signed. But there had been a telegraph commission that had come out to Manitoba several years before. And one of the interesting things, I think, is that the First Nations, long before the treaty was thought about or considered, sent a message to that telegraph commission and said, we want to meet with you. We want to know what you're proposing for our lands. We want to know what's happening here. So First Nations were aware of many of these changes and I think would have understood, and it's just my interpretation, that a transition was occurring. And it was a very different transition, that they were going to be dealing with a very different kind of authority than they had with Lord Selkirk or with the fur traders. And they had some experience through family connections of what had been happening in treaty making in the United States, just to the south of us. But treaty making, the trusted way for First Nations to exert some control over newcomers, to share resources and to build relationships, has 2 centuries of history in their minds and their families. Throughout the fur trade, in 1817, and again in Portage-la-Prairie, as late as 1868, there is a treaty requested very forcefully by First Nations. People from Red River had been moving out to Portage-la-Prairie, to an area that's now called Burnside, and essentially squatting on First Nations land. And the First Nations of the Portage area met together, and they sent a message to the settlers in Red River, to the Hudson's Bay Company, and they also sent a letter to the editor of the local newspaper in Red River. And it was signed by a chief called Chief Musus, and it was about settlement at Rat Creek. So I've called it the Rat Creek Treaty. Again, it's not with the Crown, it's not a treaty in the way that the numbered treaties became, but what it is an indication of how First Nations dealt with newcomers. They turned to diplomacy and to their own tool of treaty making. And Chief Musu's letter, which you can read in the Nor'Wester online, essentially says, there's people living on my land without permission. And when again, one of those phrases that I sort of pulled out that are worth remembering because he makes a very general statement. He says, in the smallest of things, there must be an agreement. And I think that's a very good way of thinking about how First Nations approached the treaties. There must be an agreement, and here there has been none. And he wanted a treaty made quickly. He anticipated that there might be a treaty coming with the Crown. And so this one at Rat Creek was made just for 3 years. And it was very similar to the Selkirk Treaty. It drew a circle at the bottom of Lake Manitoba. And it said to the settlers, and the person who organized the treaty at the First Nations request was James Mackay, the Métis, one of the Métis leaders, a very important one, and linguist. He went out to Portage and sat down and talked to people for some time and made this treaty. They drew a circle, just as with Lord Selkirk. They had drawn lines on either side of the river. Here within this circle, they said to settlers, here you can raise your cattle, you can plow the soil, and interestingly, in light of later events, you can cut timber only within this circle, not outside that circle. I'll come to that in a minute. So with all this in mind, trying to understand the experience and anticipation of First Nations as they made that journey to Lower Fort Garry. This is where they had been for some centuries. 1869, Canada starts to look at the West, to a new empire of the West, and it is a significant national moment. Treaties were part, although in Canadian history books, I think even now, they haven't been framed in this way. Treaties were part of John A. Macdonald's national policy. And if anybody remembers their grade 11 history, and the national policy is about railways, CPR, it's about establishing agriculture and bringing large-scale immigration into the Western prairies. But none of that would have happened without the peaceful settlement and the peaceful acceptance and the diplomacy of First Nations in treaties. And so we really should be framing that as one of the pillars, in fact, the pillar of the national policy. Particularly at Red River, the resistance of Riel and the Métis to the intrusion of land surveyors along the rivers meant that the Crown had a problem, and it needed to meet Métis proposals or demands about land, but it could not do that in a legal sense, in a European legal sense, until it had made treaties, until it had the legal authority to make land grants and land assignments. And so it was, I think there was a pressure, 9 days of discussion at Treaty 1, and several more obviously at Treaty 2 as well. Some treaties required many more days of discussion, and then adhesions later on, which also meant more days of discussion and negotiation. But at Treaty number 1 at Lower Fort Garry, First Nations requested agricultural assistance. They were already farming. We should not assume that First Nations in this area were new to farming, by no means. In fact, at Lockport, we have evidence, archaeological evidence of 1,000 years of corn agriculture in the Red River area. Schoolhouses and teachers on the reserve were asked for, and in Red River, there had been, particularly with the Anglican Church, there had been 11 Indigenous school teachers at church schools in places like Fairford and at Saugeen, and in Red River itself. Teachers who had been trained, some Métis, some First Nations who had been trained, some of them entered into the ministry as ordained ministers, and some of them remained as lay teachers. The First Nations in the Red River area had some knowledge of European education, and there were requests for schoolhouses and teachers specifically on the reserve. And of course, you know, given what happened with the residential schools afterwards, that's an important thing to notice. And they also, in some cases, specified in later petitions to the government that these be secular teachers, not religious teachers. So requirements for additional European education, but not a requirement to forego Indigenous religion and Indigenous education. It was an add-on, it was an additional thing that was being suggested for the treaties. And when you look at the speeches that are made at Treaty Number 1, which is where we have the most material, most written material, the emphasis is upon the future. The chiefs are looking to the future, and they say, we must find ways to feed our children. So an economic future and economic security are how I interpret their goals at the treaty. And in return, it's a very short treaty, as I'm sure you know, compared to later treaties amongst the Blackfoot or the Cree in northern Saskatchewan. In return, they agreed to keep the peace and to permit some settlement and to accept, in the first instance, annuities of $3 and 160 acres per family of 5. There were also, as there had been in the fur trade, once an agreement had been reached, there were other requests that had been made and some requests that were made during the negotiations as well. And as they left the treaty grounds, First Nations assumed, I think, as they had in the fur trade, that those requests would be met by the mother, by the Queen Mother, or as they had been in the treaty, in their fur trade, with the father, the European fur trader. And these days, obviously, we think of Great White Mother and Great White Father as very paternalistic, very much the phrases of the colonial settler. But from a First Nations perspective, we have to consider that this was also about kinship, about creating relationships. And when someone was designated brother-in-law, as the Governor General, Marquis of Lorne in the 1880s was on his visit to the prairies, because he had married the Queen's daughter and hence was in the same relationship as they were to the Queen, that when you named somebody as mother or father or brother-in-law, you were also, and in their accepting of it, they were also accepting the obligations of a father or mother to provide. And so those promises that were made of what the government, or what the Crown would provide, and the position of mother, of a provider, somebody who cared for you in good times and in bad, as the fur trade chief European traders had done for their own benefit, but nevertheless had done so. All of those, I think, are part of the story of Treaties 1 and 2. And it's quite a long story, so I'm just going to move over it at the moment, and we can come back to it in questions if you have. But there were promises that were made, as First Nations said in their petitions later on the other side of the parchment, and which they expected would be kept. In the case of Treaty 1, 1 or 2 of those outside promises were kept, and the treaty payments at that point were raised to $5 a year as well. Oh dear. I wanted in this one, can the audience, Renee, can the audience see the whole slide?
Yes.
Oh, they can. Okay, well, maybe they should read it. I can only see the bottom part. But anyway, I think I know the quotation, but hardly that. What I wanted to do here was to give you a quotation from a chief at Treaty 3, and a couple of years later, obviously. But to me, this encapsulates the sense of equality, of kinship, of reciprocity, and land ownership. And it's a good way of thinking about it. And he begins by saying, this is our land where you come to. And so many treaty speeches at treaty time begin with a version of that. This is our land you're talking about. Treaty 1, one of the chiefs says, I am made out of the very dust of this earth. This is our land. And our resources, you're asking, we would ask you to lend us some cattle. And lend it to us and we will repay them and we will find on what to feed them. And the waters, meaning the Great Lakes, out of which you sometimes take food for yourselves, which was an understatement and probably slightly mockingly said, or at least ironically said, the waters that you sometimes we will lend you in return. If you give, so again, reciprocity. If you give what I ask, the time may come when I will ask you to lend me one of your daughters and one of your sons to live with us. And in return, I will lend you one of my daughters and one of my sons for you to teach what is good. Ojibwe for essentially education. Teach what is good. And after they have learned to teach us, not residential schools, not the Indian Act, not the Indian agent, not the game laws, but here's how we will learn from each other. Here is how the parallel systems will work. And we have a treaty that can make that. And this is not new. This is just a good summary of it. And you can find similar ways of being, similar ways of approaching settlers as far back again as Champlain's time and his relationships with the Huron. And it gives you a good sense of what might have been. So what happened next? And again, much of this probably will be familiar to you. And one of the things I wanted to give as an example here, of course, is into the Treaty 2 area and maybe partly Treaty 1 as well. What happened next was a very fast realization on the part of First Nations that they were to be permitted no part in administering the treaties. This is 1872, and the Crown very clearly and quickly assumes, it's really not even a formal decision, but they assume that the treaty promises and agreements, the administration of it is going to be done from Ottawa with its representatives in Manitoba. And for the most part, not entirely in the first few years, but for the most part, what will be uppermost will be the interests of settlers and the federal budget. So money and settlers' interest, voters' interest become the crucial ones. And those are some of the contexts in which the treaty promises are administered. And in 1872, at Lake Manitoba, we have a very clear and rapid example of that. In Lake Manitoba, the Hudson Bay Company had been trying to run steamboats, part of that industrial revolution I was talking about. The lake was so narrow, it wasn't so shallow, wasn't a great idea, but they persevered for a while. And steamboats required an enormous amount of timber to run. And these had to be held in cache, in caches along the route of the steamboat, about every 10 miles, I think, great piles of lumber that the steamboat would need. And so large amounts of timber were being cut down in the area north and east and west of the bottom of Lake Manitoba. And the First Nations of that area came to the left, well, first of all, they demonstrated I believe it was at the Hudson Bay Company post. And some indication is that there was an armed demonstration. And they said, no, it's too much timber. We haven't given permission for this timber to be taken. And you can imagine that, you know, with even one or two steamboats, that things were disappearing quite quickly. And so they protested it. The Hudson Bay Company was not prepared to acknowledge or deal with this protest. And they went immediately to the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba in Winnipeg. He's an appointee of the federal government. And the Lieutenant Governor issued very quickly a huge proclamation. By huge, I mean actually really big in size. And it's in 3 columns. In one column in English, 1 column in French, and 1 column in Cree, as far as we can determine. Although I'm told that it's an older kind of Cree and uses an older vocabulary. But in any case, what it did was to limit First Nations access to timber only to their reserve lands. And remember, these are very small reserves, 160 acres per family of 5. and in many cases had not been properly surveyed yet. Surveys were busy staking out land for settlers. It was difficult in some cases to know where those reserve boundaries were. This had never been discussed at the treaty. In fact, the written evidence that I have looked at shows no discussion of timber at all, although it was discussed by the commissioners the year before the treaty was signed, when they met, caucused, we would have said. They caucused together and said, here's the kind of boundaries we're looking at. We must get the timber. And they were particularly talking about the area north of the little postage stamp of Manitoba. So it's certainly been on their mind, but it isn't entered into the formal discussions at treaty time. So no wonder it was a shock to the First Nations of Lake Manitoba. So what it does is racialize, of course, resources, and it gives a far greater access to a livelihood, and timber at that point much in demand for export to Minnesota, Wisconsin, and to the building of cities in the United States, much in demand at Red River for the construction of infrastructure for the new settlers coming in. So it was not just the forestry practices of the previous 20 or 30 years. This was new, and it was happening very quickly. And so what it did was to restrict the access to livelihood and unequal access by, wasn't really legislation because there was no legislature. It was simply by decree. Okay, and then we'll move on. And then the second aspect of what happened next, I put it into two phrases. One is the administration comes only from Ottawa, and the annual meetings and the tweaking of discussion of treaties that First Nations, I think, had anticipated from their experience didn't happen. And First Nations, I would say, are transformed in the next 20 years from what they had anticipated as being partners in a process, as they had been for 2 centuries, to becoming petitioners. And the files of the Department of Indian Affairs, of schools, of the Northwest Mounted Police, of health departments are just full of petitions of First Nations, because that is all that they can do, from partners to petitioners. And then what happens as well in 1876 is, of course, the extension of the Indian Act to Western Canada. The residential schools, the criminalization of Indigenous religion, the game laws that were attempted to be imposed, somewhat unsuccessfully on First Nations in the beginning, a lot of resistance to that. Passed laws limiting the freedom of movement of Indigenous people, obviously never agreed to or mentioned in a treaty at all. By the 1920s, a very limited access to the courts of Canada for the petitioners to get reprieve. Very early on, 1874, people of St. Peter's Reserve in Treaty 1 lost the vote. They had anticipated, and some did, voting in a federal election that year. But by decree, by the Indian Act, the vote was taken away from them. And they were very angry about it. And the missionary wrote many letters on that, several letters, I should say, on that basis. And they were also limited in their access to commercial agriculture. At one point, only the tools that they made by hand was permitted on reserves, particularly amongst the Dakotas and amongst others in the Manitoba region. There are reasons for that, and they are, of course, racial reasons, racist stereotypes and expectations of Indigenous agriculture. And the Indian Act was never mentioned at treaty time. It's the ghost that's there. Even at the same time that it is being extended to Western Canada in 1876, Treaty 6 is being made and Treaty 7 is made the following year. And even in those treaties, when it already exists in the plains, it's not mentioned at treaty time. And I want to conclude with this. This is 1969, and the government of Pierre Trudeau elected on the basis of the creation of a just society. That was his platform. And part of that just society was to eliminate treaties, again, by decree, not by discussion or moderation or whatever with indigenous peoples, by decree. And the response, and partly this was because it's a very, what should I say? It's very much a Trudeau small L liberal perspective. We are individuals, we are not collectives. And it is unjust in a just society for one part of society to have a treaty with another. And so they set about in Jean Chrétien's white paper, ending the treaty relationship. And the response from First Nations was very swift. The Indian Association of Alberta in particular produced a red paper, later became a book, which was widely distributed in Canada amongst non-Indigenous people as well, called The Unjust Society, and written by very young Cree leader, Harold Cardinal. And this is a quote from that I would, again, commend to you. To the Indians of Canada, the treaties represent an Indian Magna Carta. The treaties are important to us because we entered into these negotiations with faith, with hope for a better life, with honor. Did the white man enter into them with something less in mind? The Indians entered into the treaty negotiations as honorable men who came to deal as equals with the Queen's representatives. Our leaders of that time thought they were dealing with equally honorable people. And finally, what I want to remind you of is the themes that I've been trying to develop, and they are interpretations. They're based on the written record only, and they are limited in that sense. But I've tried to see the experience of First Nations people as a diplomatic tool of very great significance, of entering into relationships with people, and relationships that are characterized as a continuing relationship, not just one-off, but a continuing relationship of mutual obligation, as we could see in some of the quotations and stories that I've tried to tell. But from the non-Indigenous perspective, treaties came to be seen for a long, long time as a once and for all event. Treaty, sign that, off the agenda. And a very large scale real estate transaction. Much less than the continuing relationship that First Nations had believed they had entered into. But the Treaty Commission and many other peoples are, I think, spreading a greater knowledge of treaty making and understanding of the treaty, and we embody it in that sense of we are all treaty people. One of the slogans that the Treaty Commission has adopted, that we all have a stake in the treaties. We all had a stake in the treaties at the time of their making, and in honoring that, the nature of that relationship. So that's where I'll end. There's time for, I think, Renee, for some questions.
Yes, if anyone has any questions, they can ask them now. And I just want to thank you for, again, you always seem to present it in such a way that it's very easy to understand and doesn't include like on this day this happened, this day that happened. So sort of sharing more of a story, which is important here. And so anyone have any questions or comments?
Thank you, Renee. It's Roy Dawson.
Okay.
Good morning.
Morning.
Professor, thank you very much for a difficult presentation to go through centuries and make it so concise and understandable. And it's important. The history is important for the Treaty 2 people that are trying to assert their rights under the treaty. Something that we have brought up and you touched on and may be helpful you indicated 160 acres per family of 5 in our Treaty 2, and you made a brief reference to the ability to develop cultivation and agriculture in the territory. And one thing that has been asserted by Treaty 2 is there was a promise not only of 160 acres, but the Indian commissioner at the time, Wymus Simpson, set down in writing that this would allow the First Nations in Treaty 2 to move to agriculture when they chose to do so, and lots of land would be set aside for that purpose. We did a land survey a year ago. There are 303,000 acres of reserve in Treaty 2 territory. We did a soil analysis, and 0.06%, less than 1% of the land can be cultivated and can sustain any sort of agriculture. That seems to be somewhat contrary to the promises made by the Indian Commissioner at the time of the 1871 treaty. And I just wonder whether you've had any insight into that evidence, that would be helpful to our group.
Okay.
It's a big question, I know.
It is, and I don't want to, I'm going to talk off the top of my head, right off here.
Absolutely.
All the gray hairs up there.
Yeah. You can see the importance of it, because we have a multi-billion-dollar claim if, in fact, we can prove that fertile land was promised, and we can obviously prove through Canada's own statistics that 0.06% represent what we actually got. So that slipping by that 160 acres, everyone thinks, oh, it's nice farmland, but we got 303,000 acres of gravel and swamp.
Yeah.
And you can see the potential claim in that respect.
Yeah. As far as I know, the surveyors have you looked at the surveyors' maps for this?
Well, I'm not so much interested in maps. We actually have a surveyor that has those maps. We've got all those.
All that stuff.
But it's more about the fertile land promise.
Yeah.
That we suffer from significant evidence to make a specific claim.
Well, I think the Crown at the time would not have had a lot of information on soil fertility. And that's why I was mentioning the surveyors' maps, because in some cases they did estimate. They weren't doing digs, and they weren't doing the kind of scientific analysis that you could do now. In many ways, I think the Crown was blinded by its own propaganda. If you look at any of the newspapers, and I've looked through some of the ones in England at the time, Manitoba, we tend to think of Manitoba as a very small province, not that particularly significant, but man, it was the talk of the town in the 1869 to 73-4. This was good black earth, and everybody could make their fortune there and head off to Manitoba. It was like a gold rush. So I think blinded by that would be part of it. Promising fertile soil. I mean, you're back to the principles of the relationship. This was a relationship where agriculture was anticipated, and that served, I would argue, in fact, do argue that it served the purposes of the Crown, because they would not have to, as they did in some areas, as the buffalo decreased so quickly, they would not have had to supply rations for First Nations in this area. And that was very much on their mind. I mean, that's the budget issue. So it was to their advantage to ensure that the lands were fertile, or to assume that they were. As you move into further administration of the treaty, then I think you'd have to know, why did they not respond to the infertility? Why did they not ensure that the land was fertile, that people could make a living off it? I think that would be some of the arguments to be made, because the treaty relationship argues for that kind of certainty. If I put into the Crown's mouth, we want you to farm, we want you to be self-sufficient. Here's the here's the means to do it. The tools are only part of it, and some of those weren't provided either. And the soil is another. But I've not heard this argument about soil before, but I can very much appreciate it. And but there was that great sense that Manitoba was full of big black earth, and anybody could make their fortune here.
It's just not lost on me that somehow out of 303,000 acres,
Yeah.
it was all gravel, and it could not have been an accident.
Yeah,
that would
that
be,
was a
that would
sign.
be, I think that would be a good bet in Las Vegas. And our issue is obviously the argument that Canada would make is that, well, you chose where your reserves are, but
Yeah,
in 1871 we didn't. Our group did not know that there were going to be reserves, and that this
yeah,
promise of fertile land was going to be made into these gravel pits.
yeah.
So yeah, and I'm just curious whether there were. I have some evidence, obviously, from the writings
Mm.
of Weymouth Simpson about what he promised the people at the time of treaty, but haven't gone beyond that or don't have access to other evidence or information about that issue. And as you can see, it's an extremely
Yeah.
important one for Treaty 2.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, at the time, I mean, First Nations, yes, quote unquote, were supposed to be choosing the reserves. But what was important at that point, right at that point, was timber. You're looking for timber. You're looking for all the reasons that First Nations needed timber, you know, for fuel, for construction, for all sorts of things, for bark, for all kinds of construction. And also looking for water, fresh water. I mean, that was how campsites were chosen. It was what people looked for shelter and for survival. So the first, I would think, the first instance would be for First Nations to ensure that, and only later are they going to, you know, be faced with the gravel pits.
Yes.
There is, I wanted to mention one other thing. At Treaty 1, in the discussions as reported by the Free Press, by the press, the commissioners, the First Nations ask, again, that sense of looking to the future, what if our population is to expand? What happens then? I'm sure you've seen this. And the commissioners say, well, we will find land for you further west.
Yeah.
Now, did they say that at Treaty 2? I don't know. You know, has it ever been followed up on? I would think it has at some point. But I thought, to me, it's an example of how First Nations thought about the future, you know, because so much of non-Indigenous stereotypes is that First Nations didn't think about the future, you know, that they were hunters and they waited for the buffalo to pass in front of them, which of course is, you know, so far from the truth that hard to make the argument. So thinking of the future, what if our population expands? What will we do? And he says, well, we'll look at lands further west.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative, and I don't want to monopolize all your time
Sure.
with other people that might have questions. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Kim, you had a question. Did you want to ask the question or?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to ask. I just wrote it down so I don't forget. But when you had referenced Treaty 2, and they talked about promises for schoolhouses and teachers, and I understand that Treaty 10 has reference to a medicine chest. So I'm the health and well-being circle keeper, so I'm working in that area. So I'm wondering, as context and background, what can I share and create awareness with regard to what was in the treaty promises, or because I haven't seen reference to the health per se explicitly. So how do I incorporate that into the work that I'm doing? And then also for the other circle keepers as well too, right? Because health and is so broad. So
I'd have to think about that. But what I will say is that it enables me to mention something that I hadn't talked about here, is that every treaty is different. And Treaty 6, and in particular, the Northern Cree Treaty, which is in part of Northern Manitoba and part of Northern Saskatchewan and Alberta as well. Treaty 6 has a medicine chest clause in as well. And the reason for that was the extreme suffering that First Nations were undergoing in that area at the time of the treaty. And so they negotiated for, they bargained for that medicine chest on each reserve. And over the years, they ensured that that was seen, well, they tried to ensure that that was seen as the spirit of the treaty, not just that chest, medicine chest on the reserve, but the spirit of the treaty meant that medical assistance and wellness would be considered as part of the treaty relationship. So in each treaty, in Manitoba, there wasn't, at the time of treaty making, the starvation that had later occurred on the prairies. It happened very quickly soon after, but Manitoba always had a good supply of fish. It has some wild rice, and it didn't have the same level of starvation that elsewhere did. So there wasn't the negotiation of that particular clause. And so you have to look at each treaty. By the time you get to Treaty 7, in the Rockies, the Blackfoot Treaty, the payments have become much more, and they become much more specific in terms of not just rifles, guns to be part of the treaty, but Winchester rifles, the very most modern Winchester rifles, to be given as part of the annuities at treaty time. So and that was because they too, well, actually both disease and epidemics, and same for the Cree in the plains too, were there at the time of the treaty, very much on people's minds. So each treaty is different. The elements of each treaty, the promises are different, and they build on each other too. And except for Treaty 5, which is an anomaly in many ways. So I would say that, but to get to your question of how do you build from the treaty to issues of wellness? Well, I would emphasize without, there isn't a section that deals with a medicine chest. And of course, the province is much more a part of wellness issues now than it ever was at the time the treaties were made, or that it was anticipated. And Medicare has made a difference in access to healthcare for many, but not all First Nations. So times are different in that sense, but I would build on the sense of equality in the treaty relationship. This is what we wanted. This is what we approached as equals. We approached as owners of the land. We approached with a message of maybe assistance in some cases, but certainly of maintaining peace. That's one of the major elements of each treaty, is maintaining the Queen's peace, as it's sometimes called. So maybe with that sense of equality and reciprocity, and the relationship as part of a sense of well-being, of self-sufficiency, of pride, of responsibility, all of those things, I think, might be developed from that, a different sense of the treaty relationship than that, land speculators' sense of it, once and for all, and off the agenda. You may also look at the fact that in Treaties 1 and 2, there is no mention of hunting or fishing. And my assumption from that, and that was what some of these cases were built on, the legal cases that Mary Sinclair wanted to deal with, that there was no assumption that game laws would be applied, that closed seasons, that net size would be applied. And when there was just no mention, the assumption was yes, transition, in fact, asserted verbally, transition to agriculture, but hunting and fishing, and I think it refers to them as vocations, would continue. It's not written in the treaty, but it's certainly there in the discussions. Continue to be hunters and fishers, and on top of that, we will add some agricultural implements and possibly a farm instructor. So the assumption that they would be able to feed their children, you know, the requests that they made, we must find ways to feed our children, the future. There would be an assumption of no restrictions on hunting and fishing. And yet that administration, that regulation of the treaty is very quickly taken up by the Crown alone. And both province and federal government in fisheries and in game start within 3 or 4 years to try to assert license fees for fishing and hunting. And the response again of First Nations is the documents of the Indian Affairs Department are very, very full on this. And I've written about this in an article. There are letters from Saugeen and from Broken Head in particular. And I think there may be one from Treaty 2 as well. Did you think, and the one from Broken Head I like especially, because he says, do you think I would have entered into a treaty, made a treaty for $3 a head if I thought you were going to charge me $2 for a fishing license? You know, don't be ridiculous. And essentially, I think Saugeen is the one that's a much longer letter of resistance. And it says, look, we're sending this notice back about licenses because it's against treaty. There was no restriction on this in the treaty, and that was what we agreed to. You know, and that's within 2 or 3 years of making the treaty. So I think that sense of well-being, of being able to feed the children, and of the record that there is of their resistance to that very soon after the treaty was entered into is pretty clear. Does that help? Kim?
Yeah, you know what, I really do appreciate that. You know, because I try to, I guess I've always tried to wrap my head around that.
Yeah.
You know, because I worked in health and, you know, trying to make those arguments where, you know, equity is important, substantive equity too, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I appreciate you reminding about the starvation policies that the government implemented further down west. And at that time, like I don't, when the time the treaty was made in Manitoba for Treaty 2, maybe it was just starting, I don't know, you know, but the assumption that, yeah, the treaties are to benefit health and well-being, even though it's not explicit in there. So I think I'll focus on that spirit and intent of the children. So I do appreciate that. And, you know, our future was supposed to be healthy. We're supposed to be well. And instead, the feds breached all that by implementing residential schools, putting in all these policies. And then you have the province that have their own practices and policies where they don't provide services on reserve. And, you know, so just you add all that up and this is where we are today. So now it's trying to restore that and get back, right? So yeah, so thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay.
Hi,
Hi.
Yushu. Dakota Dishnakaj, Namatanjinji in Treaty 2 territory. So I just want to say I appreciate your presentation, very enlightening. And I just had one question, and it goes to timber. So I just want to know, I think you said, let's go back to my notes here. You said around the 1870s, they started doing timber, and that's when, you know, protests from demonstrations from First Nations started happening.
Mm-hmm.
How long did how long did that continue, and when did it move on to the reserves?
my basic answer is I don't know. I can't give you a date. In the case of the Manitoba movement to reserve, well, in fact, in many movement to reserves, except in Saskatchewan, the movement to reserves was fairly slow. You know, some people would move, and then they'd move away again. They'd go somewhere else, or they'd go join other family members. It wasn't sort of, you know, a one-shot, you know, let's take the bus and go. People continued to harvest resources in ways that they had always done. But there's a lovely scene from Treaty 1 with Ozawaquin, yellow quill, who he's met by the game inspector. And this is the game inspector telling the story. And the game inspector finds him essentially hunting out of season. And the game inspector is trying to, you know, impose provincial laws. And Ozawaquin, he said, he just looked at me and he hoisted the deer on his shoulder and he turned around and he looked back at me and he said, if you were hungry the same as I am, you would kill this deer. And I think that sense of life continued for quite a long time in much the same way. The restriction on timber taking, I think, was implemented within one season. And I'm guessing at this, I'm absolutely guessing, because I don't know of any other written material on it. There was a petition, and there was the proclamation, and there isn't sort of a continuing series of letters saying, hey, people are still doing it, blah, blah, blah. So it's just a guess. But in
Okay.
Manitoba, yeah, okay.
I'm sorry, I was just gonna continue. So the reason why I ask is because, you know, maybe it wasn't documented, I don't know, but I know that, you know, my dad's 70 years old, right? And I'm from Penawatan First Nation, so that's Fairford. You mentioned that during your presentation. So he recalls, you know, from being a little boy, up until his teens. He said our whole community was just full of tall, big timber, you know, lots of pine trees. We had so much timber, he says. And then one day they came in, they cut all our timber and they left. But they left the non-Indigenous communities alone, kind of like Grahamdale. You go to St. Martin, which is like literally 20 minutes, like, you know, 15-minute drive. They have all their trees intact, but like, you know, you go onto our community and there's like just baby trees. So that's why I was asking that, because I know that after the fur trade, you know, they needed to make more money, right? So timber was the next option, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know, how long did that continue in Manitoba, and when did it continue, start going onto our communities, right, our reserves? Because it did happen. You know, these are living, you know, our living elders say that they came.
Yeah.
There might not be no documentation, but it happened.
Yeah. In some cases, the Crown might give a license to people. You know, some entrepreneur could claim that he had a license to cut on the reserve. If it's your father's story, I mean, we're talking post-Second World War, or possibly during the war, when there were different regulations around reserves and quite a bit of land. And again, I'm going from Saskatchewan examples, not from Manitoba ones, but during the Second World War and in the First World War as well, Indigenous lands were taken for agriculture. And there would usually, well, sometimes be a band council resolution, as they were called, and they're a vote, and in theory, pressure would be brought to bear, etc. So they were taken for agriculture, you know, for food that had to be produced for allies in Europe and for troops and that kind of thing. And I have to say that my research doesn't go up that far. I'm very much 19th century. But I do know that, and I really would like to follow timber policy on reserves right through to the present day. In Treaty 5, in the PA, for example, part of the treaty that was added in the early part of the 20th century was to create a special timber reserve for Treaty 5 near the PA, and I think it still exists, but I haven't had the opportunity to track down those kinds of things. So so hold on to the story, you know, if you can write it down so that other people, you know, or other researchers later on would know of it, that would be, or your dad would, is he still alive?
Oh yeah, he's
Oh, okay, good.
yeah.
You know, if he could record it in some way.
Yeah, I think that'd be an interesting topic to, with, you know, elders in my community, to talk
Yeah.
more about that, more people bring it up, because there's a lot of stuff
There is.
that's undocumented, right? So
Yeah,
But-
absolutely. Yeah.
Dakota, that point is extremely important, and because oral histories are very much recognized, and that story that you just told is very important in terms of a potential resource claim in the future. And any recordings, if you could establish a set of questions and as the professor indicated, record that oral history, it may be extremely valuable in the future in terms of a resource claim. So I'd encourage you to not just talk to your father, but certainly record what he has to say, and any other elders that may
Yeah.
have those kinds of stories, whether they relate to timber or other issues. I can't tell you how valuable that would be, both in terms of research and potential claims. Thank you.
for sure, no problem.
Okay. Excuse me. It looks like we're going to close things off now.
Okay.
Thank you so very much, Gina. I always enjoy listening to you because you are able to make history interesting.
Well, I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah.
An hour is a long way time to sit through it, but we
Yeah.
made it.
Yeah. Well, it's like a university class, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you again very much.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
for sharing.
exactly. Now I go to leave meeting.
Yes.
Thank you so much.